A 17-year-old boy dies suddenly while playing basketball for his high school team. He had no significant medical history. His left ventricle at autopsy is shown below. Which of the following is the most likely cause of this patient's death? Go ahead and pause the video and try the question yourself before we go into the solution. So before we dive into this question, it's important that we understand what a sarcomere is. A sarcomere is the functional unit of striated muscle. So what that means is that cardiac and skeletal muscle have sarcomeres, but smooth muscle does not. Looking at a sarcomere can be really confusing, but we're going to break it down step by step. So the very first thing that we should note is that these red chains, these red lines, are going to be referring to myosin filaments, which are thick filaments, and these blue lines are going to be referring to actin filaments. And during muscle contraction, the myosin filaments contract, and actin moves closer to the center, whereas myosin moves further from the center, moves further away from midline. And the movement of myosin is what pulls actin towards the midline. So now that we understand what we're looking at, let's talk about the individual parts. So here we have the Z line, and we also have the Z line right here. So the Z line marks the beginning and the end of a sarcomere. So the definition of a sarcomere is from the Z line to the Z line. And a way to remember this is that Z is at the end of the alphabet, just like the Z line is at the end of a sarcomere. Here in the middle, we have what's called the M line. So if you remember M for M line and M for middle, this one should help you remember what the M line is. Additionally, we have what's called the I band. The word thin filament, which is actin, has the letter I in it. So that should help us remember that the I band contains only thin filaments. Additionally, the H zone is composed of only myosin or thick filaments. And myosin being thicker is also heavier. So the H zone is the heavy zone because it consists only of myosin. And lastly, we have what's called the A band. And the A band contains both actin and myosin filaments. So the A band contains all of the filaments. So the A in A band stands for all of the filaments. One last thing that we should note is that genes that encode for the myosin binding protein, as well as the beta myosin thick filament, genes that encode for these two proteins often are defective in a disease called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a type of autosomal dominant disease in which sarcomeric proteins such as myosin binding protein C and beta myosin heavy chain are defective. And so here we have the lumen of the right ventricle, and here we have the lumen of the left ventricle. The reason why the left ventricular lumen becomes so much more narrow than the right ventricle is because the cells that make up the interventricular septum, which are sarcomeres, are added in parallel. So they keep being added like this until it narrows the lumen of the left ventricle. And so the left ventricle becomes incredibly hypertrophied, and there is a problem in diastole because there is less preload because of the hypertrophic interventricular septum. And so what ends up happening is that, according to the Weger's diagram, end diastolic volume, or preload, is directly proportional to stroke volume. So with less preload, there's less blood being pumped into circulation during systole. And so this is a type of diastolic heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, because even though preload is less, afterload is less. So the proportion between those two is preserved, which is what ejection fraction is. A characteristic finding of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is sudden death during exercise. Additionally, neurologic symptoms such as syncope may occur. Physical exam findings include an S4 heart sound, as well as a systolic murmur. And the systolic murmur gets worse whenever you decrease preload, such as the Valsalva maneuver, or you increase afterload. Because whenever you would have the patient do something like clench their fist. Additionally, regurgitation of the mitral valve may occur. There are other conditions which are associated with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, including chronic hypertension, Friedreich ataxia, as well as Fabry's disease, which is a type of lysosomal storage disease. So now that we understand what hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is, let's go back to the question stem. So this question stem is a healthy 17-year-old boy who suddenly dies after exercise. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is very appealing as an answer choice already, but here we can see sarcomere is being added in parallel, which narrows the lumen of the left ventricle. So this is confirmation that this is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Additionally, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is caused by a mutation in either the beta myosin heavy chain or myosin binding protein C. So, answer choice D, a mutation in the beta myosin heavy chain, is correct. A, or enterocyte infection, which is or for instance, Coxsackie virus B. This can cause heart failure, but it would be a type of systolic heart failure, or sarcomeres being added in series instead of parallel. So that's not correct. A frameshift mutation in dystrophin gene, as seen in muscular dystrophies, this presentation isn't really correct. You would see things like difficulty walking, Gower's sign, calf pseudohypertrophy, and it would be unusual for this patient to have no medical history as well as a muscular dystrophy. Ischemic myocardial disease. So this is often seen in patients with chronic atherosclerosis and wouldn't really be consistent with no significant prior medical history. The last, transthyretin deposits in the myocardium. This is referring to amyloidosis, and the patient is typically too young to have these amyloid plaques build up.